Fighting Through Podcast, Episode 71, The Battalion Artist. A Navy Seabees sketchbook of war in the South Pacific. More great published history. As soon as the push across the Pacific began, the construction battalions displayed their engineering ingenuity and pluck. They struggled against unimaginable conditions, and the Seabees' baptism by fire came at Guadalcanal. The Seabees would be building bases so that American troops could move forward. That they knew, but where exactly? That they did not know. Nat strove to recreate on paper the heavy, dark intensity he felt when it was his turn to be on ship's lookout. Time seemed to stand still, but any let-up in concentration was not an option, for even a moment's distraction could cause disaster for his shipmates. After finishing his painting of the patrol bomber PBY-50, the plane took off on its mission. Nat kept an eye out for PBY-50 over the following months. Hello again, and another warm World War II welcome to the Fighting Through Second World War podcast. I'm Paul Cheel, son of Bill Cheel, whose World War II memoirs have been published by Pen and Sword in Fighting Through, From Dunkirk to Hamburg. The aim of this podcast is to give you the stories behind the story. You'll hear memoirs and interviews of veterans in all the countries and all the forces. I dare you to listen. A long time ago, from a country far away, a lady called Janice Blake wrote to me. Actually, it was about 2 years ago, but what's a pandemic between friends? American Janice said, "When Nancy Bellantoni and I first began to search for a publisher for the Battalion Artist, we were told interest in World War II has passed its peak. Not so. I'm discovering more and more children and grandchildren of World War II veterans who are compelled to tell their fathers' stories. My mother's 4 brothers were all in the service during the war, 3 overseas. I was well into a book retelling my Uncle Joe's stories when Nancy Bellantoni called me in 2012 to tell me her father was dying and wanted us to put together a book about his World War II paintings. Well, thank you, Janice, and the rest is history, as they say. So roughly 10 years in the making, Janice and Nancy have finally got Nancy's father's works published in a magnificent volume of narratives, paintings and photographs, all depicting the war adventures of Nat Bellantoni and his naval comrades in the famous Seabees, and the book's been published by the Hoover Institution Press. And that is the main subject of today's episode. We also have some great family histories coming up later, which will feature Japanese kamikaze planes, submarines, international soccer rivalries between forces, and even more Seabee action. So do stay with me to the end. And you do not want to miss the PS, I'll warn you now. Nancy Spencer has sent me a great memoir about her father's World War II adventures as a Seabee. Just a couple of bits of feedback before we get going. Thanks to Timmy Geo from USA, who posted a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Tim listens to the show while he drives for Uber Eats, and you can see Tim's Like Riding with a Mate review on the Fighting Through Podcast website. Oh, thanks, Tim. This is Dave Mcnulty. Hey Paul, I'm a 32-year-old new listener to your podcast, and I just want to say this channel was a gem of a find. Being Irish, I've no real connections to the World Wars, but my nanny, who is in her late 80s, was a kid during the war and only remembers the planes flying over Glengarriff in County Cork. She does remember turning off lights and hiding under tables, but that's about it. P.S. My last listen was the episode 29, POW story with Brian Asquith, and this was an amazing story. Dave, yes, it was. It's one of my favourites, and God bless the kind Polish people in that episode. So if you want to catch up, listener, POW episode 29. Dave, you've got somewhere to go to catch up. See you again at Christmas, maybe. Talking about Christmas, which I wasn't, but I will. I'm planning a special Christmas episode, a bumper Christmas episode in December. So if anyone's got any wartime stories, send them in, please. I'll remind you again later. And from now on, I'm going to use that transition pinched from The Voyage of War by Mark Peters that you heard in the previous episode. I'm going to use that to trumpet the arrival of the main event. So here goes with The Battalion Artist. The book is a Navy Seabees sketchbook of war in the South Pacific, 1943 to 45, and it relates to the 78th Construction Battalion in the US Navy, published by Hoover Institution Press, illustrated by Nat Bellantoni, written by Janice Blake, and edited by Nancy Bellantoni, Nat's daughter. Now, I can't begin to describe the full extent of these paintings of the Seabees in action, but this episode is really about the story behind them, the Seabees. And just before we get going, why are they called the Seabees? That was my first question when I heard about them. Well, CB, capital C, capital B, stands for Construction Battalion, which was fondly nicknamed the Seabees, and I guess basically the busy bees who work over the seas and far away, but more on that later. And I have to say, if I had just a small handful of sketches like these of my dad going about his business in and out of action, then wow, I would be so chuffed. As usual, any pics I do refer to in this episode can be found in the show notes. Make your way to fightingthroughpodcast.co.uk and you will open up a wealth of links and pics for each episode. This is Nancy Bellantoni to introduce the book. When I was a little girl, there were 4 watercolour paintings above a green couch, which sat on an oriental rug in the living room of our house in the suburbs of Boston. My family didn't talk about the paintings much. They were just there, 4 colourful small rectangular objects on the wall. The subject matter was exotic for 1950s America. Palm trees, thatched structures, skeletons of Quonset huts being erected, military airplanes and ships, native islanders and enlisted men working side by side. I remember sitting on that couch reading storybooks, but little did I realise the power of those stories in the images just above my head, nor the proximity to history in which I was living. My father, Nat Bellantoni, left Massachusetts College of Art in the fall of 1942, joined the Navy, and 8 months later found himself on a tiny South Pacific island in the midst of a ferocious war with no foreseeable ending. Constantly vulnerable to enemy attack, living and working in a bizarre and unfamiliar jungle environment, and perpetually longing for home and his future wife Irene, he turned to the coping mechanism he knew best. He created a visual diary. The Battalion Artist chronicles the wartime experiences of just one man, and yet it reflects the story of an entire generation. More than 16 million men and women served in the US military. 350,000 of them, like Nat, were Navy Seabees. I had the honour of meeting some of them as I accompanied my father, then in his 80s, to reunions of the 78th Construction Battalion in various states. These generous, strong men were proud of their service to their country and to the world. This book is my father's tribute to them and to all that they accomplished. In his role as the Battalion Artist, my father worked closely with the battalion's photographer and writers to create the battalion log, 78th Naval Construction Battalion, as well as the daily newspaper Tractor Tales. A compulsive archivist, he kept at least one copy of every photograph snapped by Edwin Keegan, some of his own paste-ups for the battalion log, a raft of Navy documents, handouts and mementos, both official and unofficial, as well as gifts from native islanders and even seashells. 75 years later, when Janice Blake and I began to plan how we'd create this book, we had 20 of his paintings, several sketchbooks, his letters to Irene, over 700 photographs and other treasures from the 1940s South Pacific that he'd saved in boxes. Sitting in my living room, surrounded by all this, Janice and I realised that our objective was not just to write about Nat's paintings, but to insert all these priceless items into the timeline of history. It's a rare thing to experience authentic World War II images in full colour. Nat's paintings allow us to see and feel the colours and textures of his wartime life through the prism of a curious and creative young man. He painted what he saw. It was his passion, not his job. His subject matter was his daily life. Endless weeks at sea, harbours and ships, men at work, airstrips, the local countryside, and the view of enemy planes overhead at night from his foxhole. As a child, I carefully studied the 4 paintings, memorising the brushstrokes, the colours and the compositions. I knew they were from the war. I also knew bits and pieces of stories, like the one about the tribal chieftain who wanted Nat to marry his daughter and gave him a string of dog's teeth as a preview of the valuable dowry he would provide. My mother wore that keepsake as a necklace on special occasions, but mostly there was no true context for these paintings in my suburban life. I realise now in retrospect that for my parents, the paintings over the couch were symbols of the life-changing experiences the two of them had shared, despite the fact that they did so from opposite sides of the world. A perennial and subtle reminder of difficult times and of my parents' very personal contribution to the triumph of American democracy. Nancy Bellantoni, Boston. The dedication in the book is to Irene, Nat's wartime sweetheart and future wife, and all the young women who are left behind, waiting, worrying, hoping. I'm now going to read from the forward section from the book to give you the backstory to what's going on. This is by Jean M. Cannon, curator for North American collections in the Hoover Library at Stanford University. Through paintings, sketches and photographs, Bellantoni documented the spirit and determination of the newly formed Seabees. Almost as soon as the push across the Pacific began, the construction battalions gained reputation for engineering ingenuity and pluck. The first CB unit sent overseas, nicknamed the Bobcats, struggled against unimaginable conditions to build a fueling station at Bora Bora in the Society Islands of the South Pacific. Following Bora Bora, the Seabees' baptism by fire came at Guadalcanal. Listener, I just want to give you a brief backdrop to Guadalcanal because it was an important element of the entire war in the Pacific. The Guadalcanal campaign was fought between late 42 and early 1943, and it was the first major land offensive against Japan. The Japanese defenders were overwhelmed by the Allies and made several attempts to retake the airfield, later called Henderson Field. Many land, naval and air battles culminated in the decisive naval battle of Guadalcanal in early November 1942, with the defeat of the last Japanese attempt to bombard Henderson Field from the sea. The enemy were completely out of it by early February 1943. So, upon their arrival on the island, the battle-seasoned Marines who were already there at first made fun of the old men. "Say, Pop, didn't you get your wars mixed up?" The newly formed Seabee battalions lacked organisation and established service traditions. So they weren't construction battalions, but confused bastards, joked the young Marines. The unfolding events on Guadalcanal, and particularly the building of Henderson Airfield under heavy fire, soon redirected the Marines' attitude from drollery to reverence. The Seabees soon proved they could organise and execute the seemingly impossible engineering feats that allowed the Marines to continue their battle across the Pacific and into enemy territory. Not only did the Seabees rehabilitate Henderson Field from a mud pit to a first-class airfield, they built docks to unload supplies from ships. They cut millions of feet of lumber to build barracks and warehouses, drained swamps in order to fight off mosquitoes and malaria, and they constructed hundreds of miles of roads on the island. Under heavy enemy fire, the construction battalions coordinated so efficiently that 100 Seabees could repair the damage of a 500-pound bomb strike on an airstrip in 40 minutes. 40 minutes, completely flummoxing Japanese bombers and no doubt damaging the enemy's confidence in its air power. After quickly and skillfully building the machinery necessary to maintain the base at Guadalcanal, Seabees could be heard sportingly reporting to their marine chums that the construction battalions had been sent to protect these helpless Marines. Inter-service heckling continued after Guadalcanal, but with grudging respect on both sides. The Marines and Army may have driven the Japanese off the island, but it was the Seabees who ensured that Americans could stay and prosper, supplying everything from ammunition magazines to a Tojo ice company that provided cool drinks to soldiers in the jungle heat. After the incredible achievement of establishing a structurally sound runway and base at Guadalcanal, the Seabees continued across the Pacific. They suffered long weeks at sea, headed toward unknown destinations, hostile climates, bombardment, and exposure to dangerous diseases. Bellantoni painted many scenes en route to what his battalion called Island X. Gene M. Cannon, curator for North American collections in the Hoover Library at Stanford University. So with that backdrop, I'm going to cover what happened to young Nat. He was commissioned February 1943, and after training by June that year, he was on his way aboard the MS Daystar. And this was June the 16th, 1943. The MS Daystar, with the US Navy's 78th Construction Battalion aboard, more than 1,000 men, slipped away from the dock at Port Hueneme, California, and headed for the open waters of the wide Pacific. The battalion band struck up the brave chords of Anchors Aweigh. It had taken all morning for the men to board the ship, each one lugging his field pack and weapon, trench shovel and machete, plus the gear and the tools that would be essential to his work. In addition, Nat Bellantoni tucked in among the skivvies and the crisp new uniforms a clutch of small, spiral-bound sketchbooks, a tablet of art paper, a supply of artists' pencils, and a box of watercolours. With these, in addition to whatever he was called upon to do by the Navy, he'd fight the war on his own terms. Future unknown, Island X. Spread over thousands of miles of open ocean were countless well-fortified islands still in enemy hands. Many of these would have to be taken before the Allies could begin a final assault on the Japanese homeland. The members of the 78th would be building bases so that American troops could move forward. That they knew, but where exactly? That they did not know. On this cruise and every time hereafter that they boarded a ship for a new assignment, the most they would be told for certain was that they were headed for Island X. Listener, at this point I'd just like to interject with a passage from Dad's memoir from when he was on the Empire Lance, sailing over to France the night before D-Day. I think the narrative goes perfectly with a painting from Nat. The paintings of a lone sailor on his bunk, facing the rivets on the side of the ship, and I'm sure this depicts what Dad described in his book. It no doubt reflects the thoughts which were also going through the minds of the Seabees. Of course, Nat and his pals would have no idea what might become of them. They know they're on their way to dangerous waters, but they have no idea what to expect. And this is what Dad wrote. Few of us slept on the night of 5th of June. Our thoughts were completely monopolised by what was going on around us and the thought of what tomorrow might bring. Most of the boys were very quiet, keeping their thoughts to themselves, as we were well aware that a good number of us would be killed, and the suspense was awful. We were facing the unknown tomorrow, and the estimate of casualties did not improve the way we were thinking. Fortunately, they were widely exaggerated, but could so easily have come true, and were still bad enough. Many lads wrote letters to be posted after the invasion had started. Others went to their hammocks early, and turned their backs to the others to be with their thoughts, alone, thinking about the loved ones they had back home, saying a silent prayer that God would keep them safe. Alone in his bunk at night, as the engine droned and the hull occasionally creaked, Nat often thought back to those frightening first weeks of the war, to the newspaper headlines and urgent, grim voices on the radio. Pearl Harbor, Luzon, Corregidor, Bataan. Nat recalled how his father sometimes shook the morning paper while he was reading, as though to catapult the bad news right off the page. After months that brought only shock, anxiety and grief, the tide began to turn. There was the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and then Midway, heralded as Japan's first decisive military defeat in over a century. Nat remembered how his mother had stood up and cocked her ear toward the radio when this good news came. A slight smile supplanted the look of worry that seemed to have given her a perpetually furrowed brow. At this moment in time, June 43, nearly a year after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese still controlled the vast oil reserves and rubber plantations of the East Indies and Southeast Asia. They were firmly entrenched in northern New Guinea. True, the US Marines had long since pushed them off Guadalcanal in the Solomons, and it had taken 7 months of gruesome struggle, and the Japanese still held dozens of strategically vital islands across the Pacific. The Seabee motto was "Can do," and always, before finally falling asleep, Nat would think about what he would be asked to do, could do, would do. And by visualising action, he pushed back the fear. Scanning the horizon. The vast Pacific Ocean covers more than 60 million square miles, more than a third of the Earth's surface. The distance between Port Hueneme and the Daystar's destination, the island of New Caledonia, off the coast of Australia, was more than 6,200 miles. The men of the 78th Battalion would be at sea 4 weeks, but Nat, like his buddies, was unaware of these statistics. They didn't yet know where they'd be headed or how long their voyage would be. They'd find out where they were going when they got there. For now, What Nat and the rest of the Seabees did know was that they were jammed together in crowded quarters, and the days were long and the routines were fast becoming tiresome. They slept in bunks stacked 4 high and took turns to eat in the mess because there weren't enough seats for them all to sit down at the same time. The Daystar was a Danish ship captured from the Germans and refitted as troop transport. The Danish crewmen had stayed with their vessel and now crisscrossed the wide Pacific endlessly, bringing to its far reaches the men who were freedom's last best hope to turn back the Japanese tide of brutality and aggression. Sailors, marines, soldiers, and these Seabees. As the ship cruised westward, the only thing the men knew for certain was uncertainty. They were sailors aboard a ship and so were vulnerable to surprise attacks at any time from bombers in the air or submarines under the sea. Their first challenge then was to stay alive, and so around the clock each man took his turn at lookout. Endlessly scanning the horizon for enemy craft was a tedious assignment. Nat strove to recreate on paper the heavy, dark intensity he felt when it was his turn to be on watch. Time seemed to stand still. Any change in the look of things, even the warm glow of the sky at sunup and sundown, felt ominous. Certainly, taking a moment to enjoy the beauty of the dawn would be wrong. Any let-up in concentration was not an option, for even a moment's distraction could cause disaster. Each man knew that when he was on watch, his shipmates were counting on him, and him alone. You know, listener, I'm absolutely fixated by the issue of taking turns at lookout. Dad mentioned it several times, and it was like some variation of so many hours on and so many off. And I'd just like to share another little passage from his book to help paint the picture here. On the evening of D-Day, the company settled down after the excitement and trauma of the day, and it was my turn to do guard with another lad, 2 hours on and 2 hours off, which was different to the usual 2 hours on and 4 hours off. In a situation such as we were in, it was always essential to be constantly on the alert. Being on duty in pitch dark, when every move is magnified out of all proportion, and a knife in the back is a distinct possibility, keeps a lad on his toes, every nerve straining for the sound of an enemy patrol. They too would be silent, listening for the slightest giveaway sound. So Nat's situation was clearly similar, except he'd be looking for either other ships or maybe the giveaway trace of a deadly torpedo heading silently towards them. Such was the responsibility upon people that Dad said they were given the day off before and after lookout duty to make sure they were well prepared and recovered. Wow. So here's a bit of Nat's experience, and this there's an accompanying picture to this narrative called Gunwatch. Although nobody ever spoke of it, the men aboard the Daystar knew very well that the water on which they sailed had absorbed and dispersed the blood of untold numbers of their comrades in arms. When the light cruiser USS Juno was sunk off Guadalcanal back in November 1942, 687 men were lost, including 5 brothers, the Sullivans. In March 43, while the 78th was still training in Gulfport, Mississippi, American and Australian planes had attacked a Japanese convoy headed for New Guinea with troops and supplies. 8 enemy troop transports and 4 destroyers were sunk. More than 3,000 enemy soldiers and sailors were killed. And of the 150 enemy fighter planes escorting the convoy, 102 were shot down. This stunning Japanese defeat would be remembered as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. With it, the blood of the enemy also poured into the waters of the Pacific. In April, US codebreakers had discovered the whereabouts of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, mastermind of the Pearl Harbor attack. P-38 fighters succeeding in shooting down his plane. So now the blood of Yamamoto himself had been spilled in this vast ocean. Nat thought about the nature of the enemy most often when he was on gun watch, and he knew it was the same for his buddies. Gun watch somehow felt even weightier than lookout duty. Scouring the horizon with binoculars was a huge responsibility, true, but if the lookout did spy an attacker, the men on gun watch knew that in that first instant of encounter, they were all that stood between the ship and their shipmates, and utter destruction. The anti-aircraft gun poised for action was always echoed in the stance of the men beside it, alert, decisive and ready. From the deck below, Nat was impressed with how this scene, awash in blues, greys and greens that blended with the sea and sky, was somehow reassuring. With those two men standing firm in the solid geometric mass of the turret, it seemed that every element of the ship was calm, confident and capable, that even the taut cables and sturdy life rafts would spring into action almost of their own volition in support of these two men. Two men who for this 4-hour watch held all lives aboard in their hands. If you can, take a quick shufty at the Fighting Through website and you'll see that very scene. I'm imagining the crew in charge of the gun about to spring into action as they shout a warning that there's an enemy ship on the starboard bow. At sea, the biggest challenge for all the men was to keep worrisome thoughts at bay. So when Nat was off duty, he did all he could to keep his own spirits up and to help his buddies do the same. They all worked hard to cheer up, distract and entertain one another. There was always something going on, from card games to impromptu competitions, whether arm wrestling or seeing who could down the most pie. There were recitations of each man's best remembered jokes and tall tales. There was good-humoured teasing and talk of home. Somehow, Kitchen Patrol, or KP, helped to bring that talk to life. Gathered on deck just outside the galley, peeling potatoes or pulling the tough outer leaves off heads of cabbage was nothing like strolling through Ma's kitchen. Yet there was something about the familiar routines of food preparation that evoked warm memories of home. Most men grumbled. They would rather be catching a few extra winks, reading a detective magazine, or enjoying a smoke and daydreaming about their sweethearts. Noumea, New Caledonia. Finally, Island X had a name. After 4 weeks at sea, the 78th Construction Battalion was preparing to disembark at Noumea in New Caledonia, about 900 miles off the coast of Australia. This sleepy colonial port was rapidly being transformed into a base that would serve as headquarters for the South Pacific Command. The camp at Magenta Bay, the jumping-off point for thousands of soldiers, sailors and marines heading towards duty at forward areas, was just beginning to take shape on the low, rolling hills that surrounded the little city. It was July the 13th, 1943. The men of the 78th would join the other CB units working to expand this camp. They would grade landing strips, build warehouse, administration and hospital buildings, construct storage tanks and plants for filling fuel drums and install pipelines. With his unconventional set of skills, Nat's assignments were more varied than most. Often he worked as a draftsman. Usually he'd be the one to hand-letter the simple signs that identified buildings and provided directions on roadways. Always he served on the staff of the battalion newspaper. Sometimes he created artwork for interiors as different as officers' clubs and chapels. Occasionally he'd be called upon to solve a crucial camouflage problem. Eventually, he'd contribute to one of the legendary morale-boosting programmes of the war, painting nose art on the fuselage of Navy planes. These included humorous cartoon figures, clever names in bold lettering, and Alberto Vargas-style pin-up girls. Often, it didn't really matter what his rate or rank was, he would simply lend a hand where needed. The sun was warm, but the breeze was cool and dry as the men on deck waited impatiently for gangway lines to be secured so they could hit the beach. Maybe it won't be so bad, Nat thought as he shouldered his sea bag, but maybe it'll be worse than my worst nightmare. The tangle of shuffling men began to move. Maybe I will come out of all of this okay. He stepped resolutely onto the slightly swaying gangway. Maybe I won't come out of this at all. Suddenly his feet in their heavy work boots were firmly planted on solid ground for the first time in 4 weeks. Maybe I should just stop thinking. It was time to get to work. Final journey. Painting in the show notes. It was an afternoon like so many others when Nat, with some free time, set up his easel. What caught his eye this time was a PBY Catalina parked on the hard stand beside the airstrip, its crew nearby. PB stood for Patrol Bomber, the Y a code for the manufacturer, Consolidated Aircraft. These versatile planes, when painted black, were deployed usually at night to stalk enemy shipping. In addition to reconnaissance, they were also sent to rescue downed American aircrews. Sleek, silent and stealthy, they were nicknamed Black Cats. With a very slow cruising speed, around 150 miles an hour, Black Cats were easy targets for enemy planes. Although it was risky, they often flew low to be less conspicuous. After finishing his painting of PBY-50, Nat decided he'd like to get the skipper to sign it. He walked over to the plane and found Lieutenant Merle Schall, who was happy to oblige. If you look at the pic on the website, you'll see that Schall did indeed sign the painting in the bottom left corner. While his crew was getting the cat ready for takeoff, Schall chatted briefly with Nat, who promised to get a photo made of the painting for the pilot to keep. They shook hands all around and said they'd hoped to meet up again. It was August 1943. The 78th remained at Noumea until late November. Throughout all those months, Nat kept an eye out for PBY-50. On January the 11th, 1944, Nat sent Lieutenant Schall a note enclosing 2 black and white prints of his painting. Less than a month later, he received a reply from the young pilot's mother. Mrs. Schall thanked Nat for the pictures of her son's plane, but explained that his note had been forwarded to her because on the night of November the 6th, 1943, PBY had been lost. While turning at a very low altitude, the plane had caught a wing in the water and crashed. 2 crew members had survived, but Lieutenant Schall was not one of them. Listener, if you want to find out what happened here, stay airborne for the PS coming later. Chapter 3, Milne Bay, New Guinea. The USS Maui, a converted luxury liner, transported the 78th Construction Battalion to its next Island X. After 5 days of zigzagging to avoid Japanese patrols, west to the coast of Australia, then back across the Coral Sea, the Maui finally anchored in Milne Bay on New Guinea's eastern tip. Massive transport vessels drew alongside. Men and cargo were quickly transferred and within days were headed north along the coast. They passed Buna, where the fearsome battle over the treacherous Owen Stanley track had ended, finally in Japanese defeat. Under drenching rains they headed across Huon Gulf at night. Even as the men were making their way ashore, Australian troops just a few miles away were driving the enemy northward. They could hear guns in the distance, but they had no time to stop and listen. Their first task was to unload their equipment and supplies. This took several exhausting days and nights, with all hands sleeping in the open and food prepared camp-style, using improvised cooking facilities until a proper mess hall could be constructed. The men were soaked at least once a day, nearly every day, by tropical rains. They were always surrounded by the distant booming of artillery, the oppressive heat of the jungle, mud, lots of it, mosquitoes, plenty of them, and the invisible threats of malaria, dengue fever, jungle rot, and dysentery. For a while, the 78th was operating farther north than any other American unit in the South Pacific. Air alerts occurred every night, and several times each day, sometimes followed by falling bombs. Admiralty Islands. Once it became clear that Japanese forces would be driven off New Guinea, the Allies set their sights on the Admiralty Islands, 200 miles north and east. The Admiralties offered plenty of space for a major US base and an ideal strategic position for moving north. It was March 1944. And listener, on the other side of the world, my dad was in Scotland getting ready to invade France on D-Day, 6th of June. So all the Allies were doing their bit for the collective defeat of Hitler and Hirohito. That trust and teamwork amongst the Allied countries is quite breathtaking and heartwarming. The 78th Construction Battalion was transferred to these islands in several waves. Those who arrived first found that the area assigned to them for bivouac had been a battlefield only a few days earlier. They saw destruction everywhere, abandoned foxholes, huge bomb craters, splintered palm trees, ruined equipment, even enemy dead, not yet buried. Just a few hundred feet away, artillery was blasting away at Japanese fighters who were stubbornly holding their positions. Nat took a long, slow look around, then tossed his sea bag aside. So this would be it, his third Island X. Outsmarting reality. Another painting in the show notes. The men of the 78th worked their fastest, barely stopping to eat and sleep. They knew that the Army, Navy and Marine Corps were all waiting. As soon as this base was operable, battles would be launched. Every man pitched in. Rate and rank and regular jobs were irrelevant. For every day's delay, the Japanese were building more pillboxes, reinforcing more bunkers, booby-trapping more beaches. The days passed quickly. Yet somehow the months did not. It could take weeks for a letter to leave Nat's tent in the South Pacific and arrive at Irene's home 14,000 miles away, and weeks more for him to receive her reply. Nat daydreamed about finding a way to magically cross all those miles. A grass skirt purchased from one of the islanders sparked an idea. Nat sent it to Irene, and she sent back a snapshot of herself wearing it. Meanwhile, Nat had wrapped himself in a native sarong and asked a buddy to take a picture of him. With both photos in hand, all it took was a little darkroom magic. There they were together. It was fun. It was romantic. But it wasn't enough. Hitchhiking, South Pacific style. Throughout the South Pacific, the islanders were eager to help the US Navy defeat the Japanese. They often served as porters, scouts, messengers, and able seamen. They used their outriggers to transport men and supplies to landing places too shallow for the Navy longboats. In return, US sailors were more than willing to assist the natives when and how they could. One of the easiest things the sailors found to do was to provide an impromptu towing service. An islander who saw a Navy launch overtaking him would wave. The Navy boat would slow down and throw out a tow line. With the line secured, the outrigger would zoom along. As he approached his destination, the native skipper would signal. The Navy boat would slow down, wait for the line to be released, and then speed away. The crews of both boats would be left smiling. These simple encounters were a welcome distraction from the grim business of war. Chapter 6. Underway. Aboard the USS J. Franklin Bell. In late April, the orders finally came. The 78th Construction Battalion would be moving out to yet another Island X. Although there was never an official acknowledgement, Nat knew exactly where the 78th was headed. They all did. As the 78th Construction Battalion scrambled aboard the Franklin Bell, there was a sense of restless energy in the air. After 5 months of working at a pace that had fallen into easy routine, the men were once again filled with both eagerness and dread. Determined since the beginning to do all they could to help win the war, every man knew that they would never reach that goal without a long, tough, dangerous and exhausting stint on one last Island X. They would need to build a massive base that would take the war to its inevitable final endpoint. The base that would enable fighting men to launch an invasion of the Japanese home island. They were headed for Okinawa, where ferocious fighting was already underway. Chapter 8. Finally, it was over. At 2:45 a.m. on August the 6th, 1945, the B-29 Superfortress Enola Gay lifted off from North Field, Tinian Island. 5 hours later, with Hiroshima's Io Bridge aligned in the crosshairs of his Norden bombsight, the plane's bombardier released its unimaginable payload, the first atomic bomb ever exploded over a populated city. The world would never be the same. On August the 9th, the second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, and the Soviet Union, having declared war on Japan the day before, invaded Japanese-held territories in Mongolia, Korea, and several North Pacific islands. On August the 15th, in a radio broadcast marking the first time he'd ever spoken directly to his subjects, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's acceptance of the Allies' demand for unconditional surrender. Japan's war had cost nearly 20 million Asian lives, more than 3.1 million Japanese lives, and more than 60,000 Western Allied lives. Finally, it was over. Leaflets were dropped by the thousands behind Japanese lines. Printed in both English and Japanese, they encouraged Japanese soldiers to surrender, assuring them safe passage and humane treatment. At long last, Nat and the men of the 78th Construction Battalion were heading home, with sea bags on their shoulders and pride in their hearts. Their achievements were now a part of history. Over the previous 3.5 years, the US Navy Seabees had constructed 111 major airstrips, 441 piers, over 2,500 ammunition magazines, hospital capacity for 70,000 patients, 700 square blocks of warehouses, housing for 1.5 million troops, and storage tanks holding 100 million gallons of gasoline. The Seabees in total built more than 400 bases. 18 were major facilities constructed at a cost of more than £10 million each in World War II era dollars. 15 of the 18 were in the Pacific Theatre. Of these, 12 were in strategically crucial locations that had to be wrested from the enemy. This meant that mountains of rubble, the debris of battle, had to be cleared away before building could even begin. The Seabee motto was, and remains, "We build, we fight," and their slogan is still, "Can do." It's no exaggeration when considering the history of World War II to say that the Seabees truly built America's victory. Nat Bellantoni would ever after be proud that he'd been one of them. Nat soon found himself in the queue at the Naval Separation Centre. "Bellantoni. Bellantoni?" Nat heard his name. He shook himself back to the here and now. It was time to step forward. Within moments he had the precious paper in his hands. Honourable discharge. It was stamped. It was signed. Now he could breathe freely. He could plan for the future. Just 4 days to go. Still an active duty Seabee. He'd married Irene. He would get a job. He was going to be an artist. He was going to have a life. And he was going to enjoy every moment of it. It was time to go home. On January the 6th, 1946, Nat married Irene Stuczynski, whose love and letters had sustained him throughout his long months at war. Together, Nat and Irene settled down in Reading, Massachusetts. They raised 3 children, Stephen, David, and Nancy. Listener, he didn't know then that little Nancy would grow into big Nancy and write this book of his amazing adventures. Once the war was won, Nat returned home and had a successful career as an art director in a prestigious downtown Boston firm. His boxes of wartime memorabilia were stored away, seemingly forgotten, as the decades passed. Now, with his children grown and his mortgage paid, Nat began to reconnect with old friends and old memories. At the age of 91, he dreamed of sharing his wartime story. This book is the fulfillment of that dream. Nat Bellantoni died on June the 23rd, 2012. He was buried with full military honours, a Seabee to the end. And clearly the girls who put Nat's story together had time to explore it with him. His wife Irene died 4 years later in 2016. And there's an obituary to Irene online, and there's a link in the show notes. So there we go. There are plenty more adventures where these came from. If you buy the book, you'll learn more about how the Seabees built a cathedral for some of the islanders, nearly drowned in drenching rainstorms, played cat and mouse with enemy patrols, how they worked under the threat from Japanese kamikaze pilots, and how they sometimes succumbed to deadly diseases and got bogged down in muddy quagmires, as Nat and his comrades in armoured bulldozers risked their necks to move the US Army closer to that fateful final island, Okinawa. My sincere thanks to Janice Blake for getting in touch, and for her and Nancy Bellantoni's hard work in getting this book to publication. This book is a unique record of scenes you just never get to see in your average book. I've put several images in the show notes, and Janice has tipped me off to the fact that Nat's entire collection of artwork, papers and memorabilia from World War II resides at the Hoover Institution Library and Archives at Stanford University. So search for the Hoover Digital Collections or use the links in the show notes. But if you want a treasured memento of Nat's War and the Seabees, you'll need to get a copy of the Battalion Artist, published by Hoover Institution Press. Do you want more? Oh, go on then. Actually, I've got stacks more to share, especially some amazing family stories related to the Seabees. And you know, I'm such a tinker, I haven't finished the story about the PBY-50 Catalina yet. Anyway, as I said earlier, keep airborne, captains. All will be revealed. Tim Berthlet has written in with a wealth of family history, and not only does it start brilliantly, it gets better and better. I've been keeping this one for ages now to tie it in with the Seabees episode I've been planning for some time. Tim says, "Hi Paul, greetings from across the pond. My great-uncle John was a B-24 pilot. He was a member of the 446th Bomb Group in the 8th Air Force. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for bringing his badly damaged plane safely home, saving both the plane and several of his wounded crewmen. My great-uncle Al was in the Navy, somewhere in the Pacific. During his service, he became his ship's barber and used his skills to open his own successful barbershop after the war. Both passed away before I was born, and sadly their stories and service histories were lost to time. Tim, I do wonder how many close shaves he had." Barbershop, get it? Moving on. "My grandfather was Joseph Roderick. After being turned down by the Marines and Army for having flat feet, he was able to join the US Coast Guard in 1942. His initial duty was horseback beach patrol on the US East Coast. Armed with only a .45 pistol and a World War I vintage rifle, he was tasked with looking for signs of U-boat activity and saboteurs. The highlight of his service was helping survivors of several ships sunk by U-boats, victims of the Kriegsmarine's Operation Drumbeat. In 1945, he began training as a landing craft crew member in preparation of the proposed invasion of Japan. Thankfully that never happened, and he returned to civilian life in 1946. I've got fond memories with him as a youth, camping, fishing, etc. I never really asked him about his service, and it wasn't until many years after he passed that I discovered his medals and some mementos of his service, which I display proudly in a frame." There's a pic in the show notes. "It was his inspiration that led me to choosing to enlist in the Navy. The proudest I've ever seen him was upon my graduation from basic training. Sadly, he passed before I really got a chance to discuss his experiences. I've got a memory from my own service which you might enjoy. In 2000... Sorry, I'm laughing before I get to it. In 2017, I was deployed to Northwest Africa in support of special operations. It's not funny yet. Near our camp was a French army camp with a contingent of your countrymen stationed there. I believe they were members of the Para Regiment, and it was one of those lovely chaps who introduced me to your podcast. At one point, we'd used some of our heavy equipment to clear a field next to camp for sport and exercise. We invited our French and British comrades over to enjoy it as well. We spent many enjoyable hours in fierce but friendly competition, both sides trying to prove who has the better version of football. We just couldn't fully embrace British soccer to be competitive. One of the paras said, "American football's rubbish. It's for little girls who can't play rugby." I'm only laughing because you're American, Tim, so I'm laughing with you. I hope that made you laugh as much as I still do, thinking of those days. Oh dear, pause for laughter from all sides of the audience. Do you know, so many times during this show, I'm brought back to the memories of Audrey Johnson in episode 33, Women at War, when there was so much ritual mickey-taking between the Yanks and the Brits. Tim goes on, "Attached is a photo of my grandfather, USCG boatswain's mate, second class, Joseph Roderick, and his awards. Thank you for your time, and please keep up the amazing work on the podcast." So Joseph's pics in the show notes. And thank you, Tim, for all that. You're from Massachusetts in the USA, and you're in the US Navy. And, of course, you had a PS, and you unwittingly corrected something I've said earlier. The Navy Seabees have a long, proud history since March 1942. They got their name from the military abbreviation for Construction Battalion, shortened to CB, and Walt Disney actually drew up a cartoon bee complete with a sailor's hat, Tommy gun in one hand and tools in the other. So henceforth, Seabee became Seabee. Have you ever seen the movie The Fighting Seabees? Once you subtract the Hollywood flash and typical John Wayne braggadocio, the script is actually based on the real details of how the battalions were formed. They came about because unarmed civilian contractors were being captured and killed by the Japanese as they steamrolled across the Pacific in 1941. Most groups were scattered across the Pacific. Groups landed on several islands in the first few waves with the Marines, and there were even Seabees in Normandy. Braggadocio, wow, what a word. I love it. Braggadocio. It means cockiness or boastful swagger. Tim continues, I served in the Seabees from 2002 to 2017, 15 years, as a mechanic of heavy equipment, 4 years active duty and the rest was reserve time. I've had several deployments, including convoy security in Iraq and the one to Africa for the camp maintenance assignment that I mentioned earlier. Tim, thank you so much for all that. You sent it in with all the great timing that surpasses that of a soccer centre forward. David Money now. Hello, Paul. My granddad on my dad's side was John Edward Money, and during the war he worked on an Air Force base in England, and my dad believes he was an LAC, leading aircraftsman. My uncle believes he sometimes worked on a US Air Force base and pulled dead bodies out of the bombers. My dad always remembers his dad telling him, I've seen aeroplanes you'll never see. He's always told me this sentence whenever I mention World War II. I was born in 1973 and he passed away before then, but I know he survived the war. I just never met him. My uncle was William Money Bill and was in the Royal Navy on HMS Milne, and he was in the convoys to Russia. I've been told he was on a ship off the coast of Normandy on D-Day. A bit of war stuff now. This is a shout out for Dan Carlin. He doesn't need it personally, but I've got to mention this. In his latest stupendous season from the Hardcore History podcast, it's called Supernova in the East. And Dan's voice for drama comes into good effect again as he rolls out a series that by sheer chance absolutely perfectly complements the memoirs of Australian veteran Les Cook, which I've recently covered. You can start Supernova at episode 63, but if you want to pick up on the part relating to Les Cook's memoir, join it at episode 66. But if you've not heard Hardcore History before, I promise you will be rejoining it again at the very start, episode 63. So if you want an insight into the brutal backdrop to Les Cook's experience in New Guinea and more, leading to the final defeat of Japan, plus indeed a perspective of the entire Pacific War, which we've just been covering in this episode, listen to Dan's Supernova series onwards of Hardcore History on a podcast player near you. And Dan doesn't pull any punches, so do be prepared to be shocked. He won't be telling any jokes. Oh my goodness, I think you've got at least another half an hour to go yet. But right now, I'm just going to say thank you so very much for your support and making the time to listen to me. It means a lot, and please rate, review, or share the show, howsoever it pleases you. Above all, enjoy, and please do hear me next time. Hey, aren't we having fun with the Fighting Through podcast? And following up from what I said earlier, if anyone has any Christmas at War stories, please do get in touch, because I'm gradually getting memories together for a Christmas special in December. It doesn't have to involve bombs and bullets, more crackers and contraband, but anything goes really. Is there any snow on the ground? Yeah, that'll do nicely. There's a PS coming up about Nat Bellantoni's missing Catalina aeroplane, and an extra bonus, extra long, PPPPS, or a 4PS as the man in the clothes shop might call it. It's a memoir from John Sirrah from the Seabees, which Nancy Spencer, who I mentioned earlier, sent in. John was her father. And if the mention of Jap submarines, kamikazes and ice cream machines gets you salivating, then you need to listen in. This memoir is an absolutely perfect complement to Nat's stories, believe me, and I actually can't believe my luck at the timing of these things being sent. I did put all the ladies in touch with each other, so I think they've been able to have a good old chinwag about the Seabees and their father's adventures. So, PBY-50 Catalina, patrol bomber. Oof, my word. You'll recall earlier I introduced the story of the patrol bomber that Nat had painted but never saw again, and with a sad revelation from the pilot's mother that her son Merle Shall had died when the plane crashed. Under normal circumstances, that would have been the end of matters, except in July 1997, more than 5 decades later, Nat received a phone call from Michael Shall, Merle's nephew, who was writing his uncle's biography, and he'd got some questions. He told Nat he was not satisfied with the Navy's report about the crash and was hoping to get more information. Nat answered Michael's questions. They began corresponding. Michael Shall eventually connected with PBY-50's 2 surviving crew members, who told him it was a Navy destroyer, the USS Renshaw, that had rescued them. The plane had been on a lookout mission over Empress Augusta Bay in the Solomon Islands when it went down. The airmen were to watch for approaching enemy ships or planes in order to protect the nighttime landing of Marines going ashore on Bougainville Island. In February 1998, Michael was able to track down a man who'd served on the USS Renshaw. Tom Redinger had been on deck the night PBY-50 went down. He remembered it vividly. The reason? PBY-50 had not crashed because its wing struck the surface of the water in the bay. The USS Renshaw had shot it down. With troops being landed at night for a sneak attack at dawn, protecting the secrets of the operation was of paramount concern, and when the Renshaw spotted the unknown plane, it followed protocol and immediately looked for the automated IFF, Identification Friend or Foe, radio signal that all US planes transmitted continuously in such situations. But Shall had turned the signal off momentarily so he could send a requested weather report. That moment had sealed the fate of PBY-50. On May 1st, 1998, Nat and Irene Bellantoni met the Shall family in Elderton, Pennsylvania, and placed a rose on Merle Shall's headstone. With that, Nat felt the sense of peace about this beloved little plane that he'd been seeking for 55 years. I'm now going over to the 4PS that I mentioned earlier. This is Nancy J. Spencer from Denver in Colorado, America, wrote to me. Her father was a Seabee as well. And if you imagine I might have got confused over having 2 Nancys, I did. But after the confusion, Nancy Spencer from Denver said, "My dad, John Serra, was a Seabee with the US Navy and served in Alaska, Saipan, and in the invasion of Okinawa. He recorded his service, and it's on the Library of Congress website, Veteran History Project, and I'm putting a link in the show notes, and we've got John actually recorded." But Nancy continues, "I found out that his camp was near where citizens jumped to their deaths. And on one occasion, a Japanese soldier ran into camp and exploded a grenade on his head. Dad had the most amazing memory, and it was so sad for me to see him ravaged by Alzheimer's. He died in 2016 at the age of 94. I have a beautiful Japanese flag he brought home, which I recently had framed to protect the fragile silk. There's a photo of the flag in the show notes, and there's some Japanese writing on it, and it's clearly a military flag because Nancy has had the writing translated. And she says, I had a cousin who was a cloistered nun in Japan, and she translated most of it for me. And here it goes. In memory of landing on the string of islands between Rye Island and Rio Island. A cheerful song of the Aka Island. The wind is fresh on Aka Mountain, the forever unshakable island of Aka. By our conquering this most beautiful land, the land is going to prosper. The young Navy men who gather together here with one single heart will not weaken in their courageous efforts, but will go on with their duty. Breaking the dream, paradise of this deserted island, the tide of culture will be swirling in it. With daily renewed strength, we will determine eternal victory. Let us rise up all together, whipping up our drooping hearts. Let us run single-mindedly towards the shore of a holy purpose. Then there's a line that Nancy couldn't translate, followed by, The battle is ended. Peace came. By Masao Otao in Aka Island. To the head of the village, Sashi Yonobuchi. And I think it's from nurses Sumiko Murai Tsumi and Hatsuko Yonobuchi. So it looks like this flag was a gift from some nurses, presumably Japanese nurses. And gosh, I've just been looking at the names of these islands. Aka Island, where the poem's writer came from, is near Okinawa. And Rye Island, or Ree Island, is near Papua New Guinea, where there was a lot of fighting, and obviously where Aussie veteran Les Cook did a lot of fighting. So this poem is from somebody based on firmly held Jap territory near Okinawa, celebrating the taking of another island near Papua New Guinea. I couldn't locate Rio Island, but no matter. Aka Island is also known as the Hospital Island, would you believe? And it seems to me like the flag was a gift to the head of the village from the nurses. Nancy continues, Dad always made his experience sound like summer camp. I knew there had to be more to the story, as I found out later from another 79th Construction Battalion daughter. Dengue fever was common, etc. So John was in the 79th Seabees, and of course Nat was in the 78th. Nancy added that her dad wasn't actually in combat, but I don't think anybody told the Japanese that, because there is some thrilling action to share later as we go through John's interview conducted by Nancy. Nancy, thank you so much for writing in, and we're going to hear from your dad right now.
This is December the 20th, 2003, recording of John J. Serra, former Seabee, World War II, and his veteran experiences at that time. I had registered for the draft after 1942 in December. I was working at Otis Elevator, where they were making crankcases for the B-29 airplanes, and a Navy officer that I met at the plant said to me, "Did you register for the draft?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How would you like to go into the Navy with a rating?" I said, "Gee, that sounds pretty good. Let me think about it." I thought about it for a few days, and I asked where I could sign up. He told me it was on Broad Street in Newark. He also told me I would probably get a rating since I was working at the construction business as a pipe fitter helper. So I reported to Broad Street in Newark and registered volunteering for the Naval Construction Battalions. They told me I would receive a rating of Seaman First Class because I had a year or so of pipe fitting background. It took a year before they called me. In the meantime, I continued to work at the construction business. I worked at several war plants and Walter Kitty Company making fire extinguishers. Also a plant where they were making machine guns, and Newark Federal Shipyard, Kearney Shipyard, all the time doing pipe work. Days and weekends, anything to help the war effort. I was finally called to active duty on early December, reported for active duty on December the 28th. I had to report to Broadway, New York, I forget the number, and I had to be there at 7 p.m. I was with a whole group of guys who were scared to death like I was. It was the first time being away from home for most of us. Probably most of us had never been out of the state, no less go to a foreign country.
No less go to a foreign country.
We were getting our physicals and they were reading off the names, and they got to one fellow's name that was hard to read, and they had to use a mirror because it was printed backwards. Turned out this guy's name was Rudolph Hess, which was pretty funny because this was the time that Rudolph Hess had parachuted into England. Turned out it was not the Rudolph Hess from Hitler's Germany. They took us by train down to Delaware, and we crossed on a ferry to Virginia. They ended up in Little Creek at Camp Bradford, which was a training camp for men who were in naval construction. So the whole group of us had 9 weeks of boot camp training then. We stayed an extended period of time. I forgot how many days, but quite a while, for training by Marines where we had to do all kind of exercises. Live bullets shooting over us. We had to learn how to build bunkers, how to defend ourselves. We had wrestling instructors teaching us how to wrestle. Anyway, after this all happened, we then took off by train to go to Gulfport, Mississippi, to a camp called Camp Holiday. When we got there, we were told everybody on the East Coast could get a 9-day boot camp leave, so we practically got on the same train back home to New Jersey, where I spent 9 days with my family and friends, and then I reported back to Gulfport, Mississippi, going back on the same East Coast train.
Going back on the same East Coast train.
We were at Gulfport for a short period of time when we were on a forced march, a 30-mile march that was very gruesome and tiring, and anybody who could not make it because of foot problem or other ailments, they were picked up and brought to the camp by truck, and those same men had to do guard duty while the rest of us got some much-needed rest. After we were there a short time, we went by train to Port Hueneme in California and did some amphibious training on the beach with full pack, which was very tough. After we finished that, we went by train to Seattle, and we were waiting for a convoy to assemble so that we could go together and have minesweepers doing the security patrol around the convoy. Most of us were pretty seasick. The water was very rough. The weather was cloudy, pretty miserable. Most of the men were seasick, and I guess out of the 5 days I was on the ship, I was sick 4.5.
We arrived on Kodiak on Mother's Day, 11th to 12th of May.
We were all glad to get off the ship and get our land legs again. Turned out to be a very nice, beautiful day in May, although there was a bit of chill in the air, but the weather was nice. The first assignment we had there was to straighten out the lumberyard because they had a severe storm they called the Willywaws. It blew the lumberyard apart, so they would send all the new recruits over to the lumberyard to straighten the lumber out until they would assign the duties for everybody. When I first landed there, I got off the truck I was riding with my sea bag, and I stepped on a rock and took a chip out of my ankle bone, and I ended up in the sick bay for over a month. When it was pretty well healed, they assigned me to work in a pipe shop handling materials and tools for the fellows doing the pipe work. I eventually went out and worked with the rest of the pipe fitters. I worked on the rebuilding of a firehouse that settled in the ground, and was all out of square and plumb, so it had to be taken apart and rebuilt. I worked on nurses' homes, and I worked on lots of maintenance on government housing that was there for the officers and the nurses. I also worked on water lines made of wood-stave pipe and got a lot of experience doing that kind of work. The weather on Kodiak was very severe in the winter. We would get all kind of ice storms where we had to have cleats under our shoes because it was so icy all the time. Very windy and icy weather in the winter. We would have willy-waw winds, as they call them, not a lot of snow, but a lot of ice. I lived in a wooden barracks with oil stove, space heaters, and inside lavatories and showers. We didn't have a real bad life up in Alaska. There was plenty of food and movies at night during the winter. But during the summer, the guys would play baseball, basketball, and different sports. We would have captain's inspection once a month at the Naval Air Station and at the hangars. We'd have to walk down a good couple of miles, I guess, and walk down a road that was real dusty, made of volcanic ash. It was powdery and gray, and by the time we got to the concrete apron, you had to stand attention on. Your clothes were not real clean anymore. A lot of the guys were put on report because their uniforms were all dirty, but actually it was pretty difficult to keep your uniform clean while walking in the volcanic ash. Time on Kodiak was pretty good, considering a lot of the other guys were fighting a war. We had it pretty good there. We were there for about 17, 18 months. When I first got there, we had a lot of Canadian flyers that were there, a squadron of them, I guess. They used to come over to our barracks because we had beer 3 or 4 times a week. They used to buy it at the small stores that would bring Army and Canadian men because we had the beer. They were nice guys. We also saw quite a few Russians that were ferrying their planes or ships from the United States to help Russia with their war effort. I worked at the submarine base, did a lot of pipe fitting work, and got a lot of experience. I also spent time where they had a naval sea coast gun guarding the sea coast of Kodiak. It was a used gun, they tell me, that was never fired in anger. They had test fired it, but I never actually saw it. But it was interesting to look at. We finally left there and came home to California. Everyone was sick going to Alaska. They were good and healthy going back to the States. I guess it was because everyone was happy because they were going home on leave. We landed in San Francisco, and within a couple of hours, all of the fellows from the East Coast were on a train heading for their homes. Anybody east of the Mississippi, so we came home for a 30-day leave. After the 30-day leave, I reported to Quonset Point, Rhode Island. I forgot to mention that while I was in Kodiak, I did see several of the Kodiak Bear, which is the largest bear in the world. They weigh only a few ounces when they're born, but they can grow to be over 2,000 pounds. They're a big brown animal that eat a lot of fish, salmon mostly, and we used to see them wading in cold streams, and they were waiting until the fish were spawning in early August until late November. They would be waiting for the fish to go by and would slap the water, and that would stun the fish nearby. Then they would pick the fish up and take all the meat off the bones without breaking the bones. They were big and clumsy looking, but they were very gentle in the way they fed themselves. I also failed to mention that while on Kodiak, we had the United States Army and Navy stop off before they invaded the island of Adak and Kiska that had been occupied by Japanese forces, and they were very successful in overcoming the enemy. Since the war, we are in possession of Adak and Kiska. While at home on leave, I was able to visit with family and become engaged to my fiancée. I reported back to Quonset Point, Rhode Island. I came home for a couple overnights and one weekend and then reported back. We went by the northern route on a train to Camp Parks, California. We had a very interesting train ride. I remember going through the Canadian Rockies, which was beautiful with all the snow, very picturesque. We landed on Camp Parks and did some more training there. And all the fellows that were west of the Mississippi, they were on their leave, and when they returned, we started to get ready to leave again. The weather was really bad the night we left from San Francisco, and almost everyone got sick, including the captain of the troop ship that we were on. The weather was so rough, we lost a life raft and 2 lifeboats, but we continued on. I was seasick, I guess, for 25 to 28 days I was on that ship. We stopped at the Hawaiian Islands, which was great. At least the ship wasn't moving, and I started to feel better. I was not lucky enough to get off the ship, but after we were there a few days, we started on our way again and continued on to Saipan Island. And we landed at night and had to unload the ship in the dark because the Japanese were still on the island and it was not secured. We would hear gunfire frequently during the day, but at night there was a lot of gunfire because they would try to flush the Japanese out. We slept in a sugarcane field the first night, and I remember getting bit by a scorpion, and I thought I was going to die. It turned out to be a severe bite, and I didn't even receive treatment for it. We then prepared to prefabricate a lot of the material we were going to be using on our next trip was going to be the invasion of Okinawa. We prefabricated the entire piping system that we would need in our mess hall, which was going to be driven by steam. They were going to be cooking by steam kettles, so we had to prefabricate all the piping from the boiler to the kettles, and also piping to hot water heaters that would use for cooking and washing dishes, and also for showers. We were there for about 6 weeks, then we started to load the LSTs. Our whole battalion fit on three ships with all our equipment, which was tremendous. We had bulldozers, cherry pickers, shovels, backhoes, and sheep puts, and all kinds of machines needed for road building and airport runways, as well as air compressors, welding machines, refrigeration, almost everything you could think of we had on those 3 ships, including a whole lot of beer and Coca-Cola. Also, while I was on Saipan, I worked on a water pipeline that was going to feed a Coca-Cola plant. Turned out that I met somebody who was an engineer for Coca-Cola that I had met in civilian life while working on a Coke plant on 7th Street and 1st Avenue in Newark, New Jersey. And it was quite interesting that I would meet this man after working at the Newark plant. He was in charge of the plant on Saipan. When we were on our way to Okinawa, after we left Saipan one evening about 5 p.m., while standing in line for chow, for some unknown reason, I did not get seasick on that ship. While we were standing out looking over the water, all of a sudden a Japanese sub surfaced about 250 feet away, and a Marine guard on our ship fired at the sub and hit it with an 03 rifle shell. That must have awakened the captain in the sub, and they quickly submerged. We took off, and it went so fast it almost looked like a motorboat scooting along real fast on an LST might be around 8 or 9 knots.
We took off and then went so fast that almost looked like a motorboat scooting along real fast, and real fast on the steam, like 8 or 9 knots.
It felt like we were going along really fast. We kept going and kept looking back. We had minesweepers and destroyer escorts as our security around our convoy. We had oil tankers and all kinds of vehicles on ships, so the fastest we could go was maybe 4 to 5 knots. Because the oil tankers were very slow, but everybody for themselves when the Japanese subsurfaces. After we were gone maybe a half hour or so, we looked behind on our horizon and we heard a terrific explosion and saw the Jap subsurface and go down again and was sunk. After the Japanese sub incident, we continued on and we came sight of the islands around Okinawa and saw a huge smoke screen. We couldn't see the shoreline or ships because it was all milky white. As we approached, some of the Jap planes were flying overhead, and turned out they were kamikaze planes, suicide planes that would crash down and land on ships and hope to destroy them by setting them on fire. We were there for 3 or 4 days before we unloaded our ship Meantime, the kamikazes are coming at us, seemed like 24 hours a day. We were completely surrounded by the milky smoke screen. On one particular day, I think it was a Sunday, a kamikaze hit an LST right near mine that was starting to unload. Luckily for us, it missed our ship and we continued to unload. And this was a long process because some of our equipment was slow moving on land and we couldn't unload until they were further down the road. The roads were very narrow on Okinawa and they were really like small pads, not having the equipment that we had. The weather was not the greatest. We had quite a bit of rain. Nobody was shooting at us other than the fact that we did have kamikaze planes all the while we were there unloading. I don't know how we missed the real bad action. The worst was that ship was torpedoed. We did see a lot of other action where they were hitting anything they could possibly destroy. We were unloading the ships and it continued to rain, and one day we had to use one of the doors of our ship that had been ripped off one way or another. We crashed into the beach and the door had to be taken off. We were able to use that door as a sled the bulldozer would push.
We had to use that door as a sled the bulldozer would push.
We put a lot of our equipment on that because the road was so full of mud that the only thing that moved were bulldozers. Due to the torrential rains, it took us a long, long time to unload. Bringing to our campsite, and the campsite was soaked too. It was really tough landing, but luckily we were able to land without anybody shooting at us. It took us about a month, I guess, before we settled down and the Japs started to intensify their shooting. The Americans and the other forces, we had all kinds of ships completely all the way around the island. Australia, England, and I'm not sure about French, but I think so. We had loads of all kinds of ships with supplies and troops and battleships. I can remember sitting in my tent at night and we could look over the island and see where the battleships were lobbying and big shells where the firing was all taking place. There was a ship that was hit. I'm not sure what the name was, but I think it was a Pennsylvania, and 55 5-gallon containers of ice cream mix made by craft that floated on the beach where our seamen were doing guard duty, and we were able to use that ice cream mix to barter with other ships for fresh meat. We were able to have fresh meat for dinner almost every night we were there, and we were able to do by one of our ensigns, Thomas, who was the man that did that, and he'd go out and holler over his megaphone, anyone had fresh meat they want to swap for ice cream? Boy, that was better than money having ice cream since the weather was very hot. That was great. We actually didn't see any action ourselves until we had to do guard duty because the Koreans were due to make an invasion landing on our runways at night. So we all had to take turns doing guard duty.
We didn't see any action ourselves until we had to do guard duty because the Koreans were due to make an invasion then on our runways at night. So we all had to take turns doing guard duty.
One night a Japanese plane did land on our runway that we had built. We started this runway about a day or so after we had landed. Within 24 hours of landing there, we had this runway finished. Within 24 hours of that, we had B-29s taking off and bombing of Japan. One night the Koreans didn't land there. They did land and they infiltrated our area, and one of our seamen that was doing guard duty was able to shoot a couple of them, but he tripped on a flare wire and was killed. I guess it was the only fatality we had on Okinawa. We continued to build roads and put a freshwater system in and all kind of refrigerators, ice cream machines, and ice machines, all run by electric power generators. We worked real hard while we were down that island. We built a mess hall and everybody had their own tents, split up into 5 companies. We worked on mosquito control, gang showers, roads, etc. When using the showers, we wet down 30 seconds, soap down 1 minute, and rinse down 30 seconds to save the precious water. Bob Hogue came to Okinawa to entertain the troops. A friend of mine who was in the Army where he was appearing took us. It was a great distance away, but we enjoyed the entertainment even though it was raining and we were standing in mud. One Sunday my friend came down to visit me and we had That Sunday off, the war had ended already, and he knocked on the screen door of our tent. He had 2 beers in his hand, so I asked him if they were cold. He said, "What do you think, I'm in the Seabees?" So we went to our refrigeration department, got a bucket of shaved ice, and got the beer cold. I mentioned the end of the war. The atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so the war ended. Most of the men were older, so they were being shipped out first. Those who were married or had children. I was not married, so I would have been one of the last ones to leave the battalion. I didn't get to work on a processing center, and while I was there working, a lot of the fellows were living in pup tents waiting for ships to bring them home. They were doing their cooking outside and had a fire on top of a cave, and unknown to them, there was dynamite or some explosive material that got heated and exploded and killed 6 of the fellows waiting to go home, and here the war had ended a month before. Anyway, we worked on that building so they would have a place to stay and chow hall to have their meals at. We worked on 2 buildings like that. In the meantime, we had severe typhoon that destroyed a lot of the ships. There were fierce winds of 150 miles an hour, and it did a lot of devastation to a lot of the encampments. Since a lot of the men had been sent home, some replacements had came in, and they were green as far as construction work was concerned, so they dissolved my 79th Battalion. I was put in a maintenance unit, 539, and I continued to do some construction and repair work. I did not have enough points to go home, so it got to the point where they had to lower the points. I left Okinawa the day before Thanksgiving and was scheduled to go home on a Navy repair ship. And we were brought out on a Higgins boat with a sea bag and duffel bag and had to climb a cargo net into the deck of the ship. The water was so severely rough. There was a storm out there, and I would go to grab the cargo net, and the Higgins boat would drop down, and I wouldn't be able to grab the net. I made 2 or 3 attempts before I was able to make the top of the net and get on the deck of the ship and sailed for California. It seems to me, better than 2 weeks. Now, we didn't have to observe the blackout. We were out at the deck at night to observe the stars, which was different than when the war was on. We got to the California coast, landing at Treasure Island in the morning, although we were quite a distance away from it. At 5 a.m., we had a general quarters sound on the ship that we had a fire in the ammunition hold. So we all ran up to the deck and stood by the rail with our life jackets on, and never did find out where the fire was. Never saw or smelled smoke, but they got us up at 5 o'clock, if that's what they aimed to do. We finally pulled into Treasure Island and disembarked, reported for muster, and brought us down to a barracks. It was late in the afternoon by the time we got settled down. They had to issue us new dress blues because I had lost my clothes in a typhoon on the island. I had them altered, so they allowed us to go with dungarees on and go into a civilian tailor, and this was New Year's Eve, the first New Year's Eve after the war had ended, which turned out to be quite a night. We got our clothes altered, then went out for dinner, saw the New Year in, and walked in confetti that was 4 to 5 inches thick on the streets of San Francisco. We arrived back at the camp about 2 o'clock in the morning, and at 5 a.m. they woke us up for muster. They were starting to send some of the men home by plane, and I went over and looked at the list, and sure enough, my name was on there. We left around 6 or 7 o'clock at night on New Year's Day to fly home to the East Coast, the first time I had ever been on an airplane, on United Airlines, and we stopped and landed at many airports, land and take off, ride for maybe a half hour for short runs, and land at another city, and finally landed in Chicago. And they told us we'd have to get another way to get home because the East Coast had a terrible snowstorm and they couldn't fly any further than Chicago. So they brought us by truck to an army base, and we stayed there for a half hour or so, and they told us that they would put us on a train to go to New York City to Lido Beach, where we would be discharged. So we rode on a coach train, and some of the fellows decided when we went through Newark, New Jersey, they were going to stop and go home. But I didn't do that. I wanted to get out, get my discharge over with, and report at Toledo Beach, Long Island. While I was there for 3 days going through the mustering out routine, I get out on January 4th, 1946, and I got back to civilian life, and that was my tenure in the Navy, Construction Battalion. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah from me too. I'm Paul Cheall saying bye-bye now.